Good morning to all my friends and family, and welcome to Jim's 5 a.m. Club. And this morning I come to you from the rocks, and as you can see here, I'm in front of the Fortune of War pub. It's been at this location since 1828. Anyway, let's go on a walk and talk. So I'll kick off today's 5 a.m. Club from this location. And the subject will be something which is near and dear to my heart. So let's kick off today's session. And what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about my grandfather, Petros Kalpaksis. And some of the background that I'm aware of and know of my grandfather is that he served Greece during World War II, and I'll just go through some of the detail there, as he is one of the many who bravely served his country and made a huge contribution to not only Greece but to the rest of the world, as the Greeks inflicted the first victory over Hitler and his Axis forces, and I'll touch on it as we chat. Anyway, let me kick off by saying that when I was a kid, I remember at Anzac Day feeling a little bit left out, that I didn't have a grandfather, or I didn't have somebody in my family who fought in those epic battles that were talked about, and my friends from school would be proudly showing off the medals of their grandfathers and great grandfathers, and in later years many of the kids would be marching in honor of their grandfathers, showing off the medals and proudly remembering their brave grandfathers. I also remember as a young man watching on television the Anzac parade and seeing the many banners that the Anzacs and the people were carrying. But I also remember seeing references to Greece, to Crete, to Egypt, to Albania, and to many other referencing Greece. And I must admit, I was very confused as a young fellow, wondering whether or not the Anzacs were fighting against the Greeks or with the Greeks. I had no idea, and I dare imagine that there are many people these days that when they see those banners which talk about Greece, Crete, Thessaloniki, and all of those other things, I dare say that a lot of people may be questioning, saying, were the Greeks on the right side, the wrong side of the battle? Were they the enemy? Were they the ally? And it's only until recently, or the past decade or so, that I've been able to do some research and to learn a little bit more about how the Greeks influenced the outcome of World War II, and how the Greeks have always been allies of the Anzacs in World War I and the second Anzacs. A lot of people are not aware that there is a second Anzac calling, where the Anzacs fought in Greece, in Crete, and we are brothers in arms. And there are many Anzacs who have been laid to rest in Greece, fighting side by side with the Greeks. But let's just go back to the story of my grandfather and learn a little bit more about World War II. So for those who are not aware, On the 28th of October 1940, Mussolini, who was a dictator, an Italian dictator, decided to issue an ultimatum to Greece to allow Mussolini and his forces to pass through Greece in order to make their way to Russia, to take on Russia, who was one of the massive army forces of the day, which of course would have had a huge impact on the outcome of the war. And Mussolini, as I said, was a dictator, an Italian dictator, and Italy, back in those days, just like it is now, a huge manufacturing nation, back in those days, Italy was a force to be reckoned with. They were a huge manufacturing country. They made cars, they made tanks, they made aeroplanes, they had ships. They were probably more powerful from a military perspective in those days, in those early days, than what Germany was. So Mussolini thought that the Greeks would be an absolute pushover. So he sent his envoy to Greece with a message to the Prime Minister saying, allow the German forces or the Italian forces, and they were called the Axis, the Nazi Axis forces, because they were aligned with Hitler and his evil forces. So the message or the strategy was quite simple. Just tell the Greeks that we'll be marching through their country on our way to Russia, and they will buckle. And they'll buckle just like every other country buckled to Hitler and Germany, noting that the Danish simply gave up when an envoy came through on a motorbike with an instruction saying to surrender. The mighty Danes, the mighty Vikings gave up no fight during World War II because they were terrified of Hitler and his forces and his Axis forces, and basically just surrendered with the white flag. Whereas the Greeks, the mighty Greeks, said, no, you are not to pass through our country. For many political reasons and ideological reasons, Greece stood their ground and said, no, you are not to pass, with those famous words of OXI. And that's why we have OXI Day on the 28th of October, and we celebrate OXI Day every year. So you can understand what happened. The Greeks stood up to the Italians, the Greeks stood up to Mussolini, the Greeks stood up to Hitler and his Axis forces, and of course they got their noses out of joint, and Mussolini declared war on Greece. And as I alluded to before, it's not just any country declaring war on Greece, it's Italy, which was a massive military might in those days, very heavily resourced and very well trained. Anyway, to cut a long story short, on the 28th of October, Greece was at war, and the church bells were tolling all the way throughout Greece. Every church in Greece tolled their bells to bring all the young men to attention and to call out to all and sundry that Greece was under attack and Greece was at war. One of the many men who answered that call was my maternal grandfather, Petros Dimitrios Kalpaxis from Vasiliko, Corinthias, from the Peloponnese, from a village in the Peloponnese. He was the eldest brother. He was newly married for the second time because his first wife, who had given birth to their second child, died from complications after the birth, and the child also died as well. His name would have been Dimitrios Kalpaxis. And my maternal grandfather, who was my mother's father, was called to battle. He was 28 years old. He was but 28 years old. And like all the able men of the time, was called to battle, to serve and to defend his country. Just a little bit of background. My grandfather had completed military service, 3 years of military service leading up to 1940, and I've got some wonderful photos of him during those years of military service. And he was a gunner. He was trained to be a gunner, and I've got a wonderful photo of him standing behind a gun with the troops around him. Anyway, the interesting point in this whole story is that my grandfather became a father for the second time with the birth of my Auntie Frida. She was born on the 26th of October. This is where it gets interesting. The 26th of October 1940, and on the 28th of October Greece went to war. So 2 days after her birth, my grandfather got up and left his village, left his family, left his wife, left his newborn daughter, left his firstborn daughter, and went to war like all the other able men, as I said before, not knowing that he was ever going to return again, not knowing what war meant, not knowing what would transpire, but he answered the call and he did his duty. So on a dark night, and the Italians were very clever in terms of when they declared war. They declared war on a night where there was no moon. So they streamed their troops into Greece from Albania. They were stationed in Albania, having taken over Albania earlier. So you could probably see the writing on the wall. So hence that's why my grandfather had done military service, and Greece were prepared to a certain extent, but the preparation of the Greeks, given their limited resources, wasn't as strong as what you could ever expect, or maybe probably as strong as probably you could expect, to tell you the truth. So my grandfather and all the other men were transported to the borders as quickly as possible. And it's interesting to note that some men came with boots, other men came with tsaroukia, other men came barefooted, because not everybody was kitted out and equipped, or could be kitted out and equipped, because you needed so many men all of a sudden to go into battle. So my grandfather was he went to battle in a place called Grama, which is in Albania. So the initial troops would have fought in the Battle of Pindar, and then the supplementary troops came through to continue the push of the Italians back through Albania. And it was bitter. It was cold. It was late October, early November, in the northern mountains of Greece, of Albania, and my grandfather would always say that the snow was waist deep. So you got men dressed, I don't know how they were dressed and what they were wearing, but it wouldn't have been the Kevlar, wouldn't have been the technology of today. And walking, marching through snow, which is waist deep. You know, there are some people there who didn't have shoes. There are some who were barely clothed, and they had to endure the bitterness of the cold, the dark, the hunger, because the supplies wouldn't have been in place to a certain extent. So it would have been an absolute ordeal. Anyway, the great news is that the Greeks were ferocious. And they were ferocious because they had a bigger why than the Italian troops. The Greeks were fighting to defend their country. Anyway, to cut a long story short, my grandfather in Albania was injured by shrapnel from a mortar shell, which took him in the hand, in the right hand, and injured his thumb, his finger, and also he copped some shrapnel in his ribs and torso, and he was injured after about 40 days of battle and had to return back home to Corinth. The sad thing is that one of his buddies, one of his close buddies, one of his friends was mortally injured and died in battle. So whenever we asked my grandfather, to tell us about the war, I remember my Uncle George, God bless him, used to prod my grandfather and ask him to tell him more about the war. And my grandfather would start to talk about how atrocious and how bad it was for all the young men, and then he would just break down and cry, and he couldn't even breathe. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't talk, he just choked up. And my grandfather, just letting you know, was a tough man. He was a tough man because he grew up without a mother. His mother died when he was young. He was the eldest boy in the family, so he brought up his siblings, and he was a man of duty and honour. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the Greeks won that battle of the Italian Greco battle, which then turned into the Battle of Greece, which then turned into the Battle of Crete, and so on and so forth. But the important thing is that in that battle, the Greeks defeated and pushed back the Italian forces, Mussolini's forces, and it made headlines all over the world, because for the first time people were able to have some hope, because prior to that Hitler and Mussolini were just steamrolling all the countries that they rolled into, and it looked as if they were going to win the war without very much resistance. But the Greeks, the mighty Greeks, who were outnumbered, out-equipped, were able to resist for 219 days, enough time to cause Hitler and his forces to change their plans, because they had to come back through Greece, so he had to get some forces going through Northern Europe, and he also had to redirect his forces through Greece to capture Greece, make the Greeks surrender, so that then they could then pass through Greece on their way to Russia. And lo and behold, that 219 days of resistance meant that when the Germans had a chance and the Italians had a chance to go through Greece and then make their way to Russia, it was winter, a bitter winter in Russia, which caused them to lose those battles and not to be able to capitalize on that initial opportunity that they would have had Greece let them pass through Greece. Anyway, that's my story. My grandfather, after his injury, served in Corinth as a nurse in the hospital, and he would have seen horrific injuries, but he continued to serve. And at the end of the war, some people mentioned that they were going to provide them with medals, but of course the men said, we don't want any medals. We did our duty, we served our country, we honoured our families, and any money that you want to put forward for medals, just take it and give it to the war widows, or give it to those who are injured in the battles. So I look back with great pride, knowing that my grandfather served in World War II on the right side, and the Anzacs, the second Anzacs, then fought side by side with the Greeks in the Battle of Crete and the Battle of Greece. And I can hold my head up high, and all of us Greeks can hold our heads up high, knowing that our grandfathers and many people in our families served their nation and did whatever they could to help change the path of World War II. And we now know that their efforts were not in vain, even though that Greece paid a mighty price, because following their OXI, following their resistance, there was an occupation, a vicious occupation of Greece by German and Italian forces, which destroyed the economy, because the forces, the occupying forces, needed to eat, needed to sleep, needed to get through the time that they were in Greece, and of course would steal, would take whatever they could, chickens, lambs, goats. So the livelihood of the people on the land was damaged. They couldn't farm, they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that, and the Greek economy was destroyed. And making it even worse, following the occupation, was a terrible, a vicious civil war which annihilated Greece. It had brother fighting brother, people in villages killing each other, family members against each other. It was the communists versus the monarchists, and an absolute ugly time in Greek history. Anyway, so that's basically it. But I do remember my grandfather sitting down and listening to the songs of Vebo, those war songs, and singing with great pride. And I could sense that he was proud and happy. And he'd asked me to go and refill his glass with wine as he was sitting there by himself listening to the songs, and my grandmother would be in the kitchen cooking up a treat, and he was there. I could see that he was there in a place of contemplation, and I'll never know. Hopefully I'll never know what war is all about, but I'm proud to know that my grandfather had to go through it, but served to the best of his ability and made us all proud, as we are proud of him. And I encourage everybody, all my Greek Australian friends, to tap into your grandparents, your parents, and find out a little bit more about who they were, what they did, where they served, because each family has a hero. Each family has a hero that we need to honour. Just like the Australians have their Anzac heroes, we too have heroes of people who fought with the Anzacs on the right side and opposed the evil forces of Hitler and his Axis forces. Anyway, let's finish up with the positive affirmation. I'm alive, I'm well, and I feel absolutely great. Thank you for being with me today. To my friends and family, stay connected, stay relevant, and most importantly, talk to your family members, learn your history, learn your culture, learn your traditions, and honour the family members who came before you, because they've done a lot more than what you'll ever do in your life, and they don't sit there posting it on Facebook and gloating about it. They just got on with it, did their duty, and made us all very, very proud, and most importantly, they made us safe. They made us safe and secure, and we need to honour their memory and to love them and to pray for them as they pray for us. Yasas and bye for now.